It's the Real News Network, and welcome back to part 2 of my interview with Thomas Barlow. Thomas is project manager and senior editor of the independent UK news outlet, Real Media. Thomas, good to have you back.
Thank you for having me.
Thomas, earlier this week we had interviewed Steve Topple of the Canary, and we discussed the fact that UK Crown Prosecution Service would soon release its findings as to whether they would be bringing criminal charges and prosecutions against members of the Conservative Party for electoral fraud. Well, the results are in, and let me turn to you. What did they say?
No prosecutions forthcoming. Well, there's one investigation ongoing, but the MPs and the Conservative agents implicated are not going to be prosecuted. So this is quite significant, quite important news that's just broken this morning, and quite devastating for a lot of people who've been campaigning for justice for 2 years. You know, this has been a long investigation, and I think a lot of people recognise that because of the length of the investigation, there was severe wrongdoing, you know, that had likely been committed by Conservative MPs, and now the Crown Prosecution Service has shown that it is not willing to prosecute, and that's concerned a lot of people, whether there is justice and whether there is whether we live in a society where there's one rule for some and one rule for others.
Now, first briefly explain to us what are the issues involved in terms of electoral fraud and irregularities that they were investigating, for those who are not following this in the international audience. And then tell us about how the decision to not prosecute is being received in the UK, particularly given that there was 29 MPs involved. And do you suspect there's pressure placed on the investigators by the ruling party?
Yes, well, okay, to explain the situation, in 2015 the general election happened, and the Conservatives won a narrow victory of 12 seats, but almost immediately there was an investigation launched by Channel 4 and the police and the Crown Prosecution Service and the Electoral Commission into whether wrongdoing had been done, whether fraud had been committed that had impacted the election illegally. Now, at a national level, the Electoral Commission found almost immediately that the Conservatives had committed electoral fraud and fined them, which was all that they had the power to do. So they gave them the most significant fine that we've had in recent history, but it was a mere £75,000. Now, the elections can be easily swayed by small amounts of money because regulations around spending are very tight. They're considerably different to the US, where we can only spend small amounts of money per area, but there's also a national budget. And in these key areas, including the 12 seats that were won that give the majority, volunteers were being bussed in, money was being spent on significant, important data collecting techniques used by Cambridge Data and other people to target messaging, swing voters and so forth. And this looks likely to have made the difference in key marginal constituencies to have given the Conservatives a majority. Now, this may have been a smart use of money, but it seems likely that, according to the Electoral Commission and the Channel 4 investigation, that this was an illegal use of money and was spent by the Conservatives in a way that they shouldn't have been allowed to do so. Fast forward 2 years, and there's still a Crown prosecution and police investigation going on. And in fact, they announced that there was going to be prosecutions going forward on the eve that Theresa May announced the elections. They had a week before written a report saying that that's what was going to happen and that's what should happen. Now we're the day before the nominations close for people to stand for local constituencies as MPs, and the police and the Crown Prosecution Service have said, no, actually, we are not going to push charges on any of the people implicated in this, despite the Electoral Commission findings, despite what Channel 4 found. There is a difference between how national funds are monitored, and that's monitored by the Electoral Commission, and at the local level, which is by the police. And the police have to prove that not only did they break the law, which they say they did, but also that there was an intent to do so. And the proving of intent is the difficulty. and it seems to be what they're using as an excuse not to push the prosecution forward. So we are now in a situation on the eve of the election where a story that could have hung around particular MPs' necks during the election has been cleared up, taken off their plates. Now the Conservatives can campaign without the charges of fraudulent activity being levelled at them.
Right.
And sorry, yes, and you wanted to say what's the reaction to this? Well, it's significant in many quarters. Many people are utterly outraged. They've known that people have been dragging their feet on this for 2 years. They know that because the Conservatives got this majority in 2015, that we had the Brexit referendum in 2016, that we've got Theresa May as MP, in 2017 now, that all of the political consequences of this are very important, and that there seems to be likely to be fraud, and there is a suspicion that if they had been committing benefits fraud, if they had been poor people or working class people who'd committed the same crimes in different ways, that they would have been prosecuted and probably found guilty. But as they are part of a ruling elite in a politically sensitive time, that maybe the Crown Prosecution Service has had political pressure put on them, and this is a concern to a lot of people. It worries people that maybe our democratic system is becoming more openly corrupt, and some will say that this is not the case, innocent until proven guilty, and that is certainly up for debate. But the concern amongst large numbers of people is that the length of this investigation, the evidence from Channel 4 and the Electoral Commission suggests that they did break the law and that they should be punished as such.
All right, and I understand that there is an article published in Open Democracy arguing that very point you're making, and that article's titled "A Bad Day for British Democracy." And if you wish, we will put a link below if you want to follow up and read that article. Thank you so much for joining us, Thomas.
Thank you for having me.
And thank you for joining us here on the Real News Network.